Well, I have always been a medical or technical writer. I started working at a nuclear research laboratory in 1975, and eventually very quickly moved over to writing in the health field. I was a grant writer for many years, and then a medical writer at the Cleveland Clinic Foundation for many years. Worked as a senior scientific writer in the Evidence-Based Medicine Center in Boston, and then became a consultant in biomedical writing and editing scientific publications in 1999, and I have been a consultant ever since. So it's been a very good career for me. I have to back up and give you some history. In 1990, I became manager of medical editing services for the Cleveland Clinic, and realized that I didn't know anything about statistics. And I began to learn about statistics and realized that the kind of book that I wanted was not available. And 5 years later, that led to the publication of the first edition of How to Report Statistics in Medicine. And that book was published by the American College of Physicians. The book is still one of their best sellers. It's now in its second edition. And the college eventually asked me if I would write this other book on medical writing, and I was happy to do that because it is the culmination of what I have been doing in teaching for many years. So it was a very easy book for me to write and a very satisfying experience. It's a hard question to answer. This is what I do, and it's what I like doing. So the book was very easy to put together because I knew what I wanted. I knew what I wanted it to say. I believe I know what people need to know about publishing in the scientific literature, and I have helped them for 20 years, and I have taught this material for 20 years. So it was a very easy book to put together. There were some areas, I suppose, that I had to do some more research in because I was not quite familiar. The different file formats that you can save an image in, for example, PNG, GIF, JPEG, all of those things, and they each have strengths and weaknesses, and so I had to do a little bit of work in that area because that's not what I would normally do. But most of the material it's what I do every day, so it's very easy to do. The book this is not a book of information. This is a book in which I relate to the people who read it. And so it should be a good experience and a fun experience. And they need to know that I know what they need to know and that I've given them that information. So it is a connection between me and the reader. But this is brand new material. My professional interest for many years has been to create or to develop medical writing as a profession. There are lots of medical writers. There are maybe 5,000 in the American Medical Writers Association. There are probably another 20,000 people who should join AMWA if they could. But it has not come together as a profession. We are unaware of our history. We are unaware of the research base that can help us become better writers and editors and communicators. Many of our members are scientists who write. And if you ask them, for example, if they are current with the literature, they will say, well, yes, I read 2 or 3 biology journals a week. But they're not getting paid for doing biology. They're getting paid for writing. And so they think of themselves as scientists, not as professional writers. So the history, or the list of historical events, it's hardly a history, was intended to get people to think in terms of a profession that has a long history and is a separate career, occupation, profession, similar to technical communication. It's a part of technical communication. But that we have an identity as medical writers and editors, and we don't have that right now. So this was an attempt to get people to think in terms of that. When you work with physicians, and to a certain extent basic researchers, they really are only interested in 5 forms of communication. And the book is centered around those 5 forms. So it's an abstract, a grant, a scientific article, a slide presentation, and a poster presentation. So the book is focused on those 5 kinds of communication, and the rest of the chapters then are directed toward other skills in preparing those kinds of communications. Figures and tables, dealing with drawings and illustrations, how to write quickly, how to write effectively, and so forth. Well, most of the mistakes that authors make are the same all over the world. And there are some specific mistakes that are made by Japanese and Chinese authors, but they're in the language. And things like plurals, or the use of the articles a, an, and the, which of course you don't have in Japanese. But those are minor things. The biggest problems that any author has is telling people why they did the work. Oftentimes they know, and it's just a matter of getting them to put it into words. But other times they studied something that could be studied instead of something that needed to be studied. You have heard the phrase publish and perish. Academics, to get ahead in their profession, have to write scientific articles and get published and so forth. But to do that, you have to do research. And if you want to get published, you have to do good research. It's hard to do good research. You need training, you need skill, you need resources, you need support. And without that, many authors are left with trying to find something that they can study and have a chance of getting published, and that's very hard to do. So the key is you will read a manuscript and it will say, little is known about the effect of X on Y. Well, that's probably true, but why do we care about what the effect is of X on Y? And that's what they're not able to do, because the reason for studying X and Y was because they could study it, not because it needed to be studied. And so that problem is probably the single biggest problem of all authors worldwide. First of all, I think that all non-native English speakers who have attempted to learn English deserve a great deal of respect. English is a very difficult language to learn. Although we do have the alphabet in Japanese, you have kanji and hiragana and katakana, so the alphabet is better. But that aside, English is a difficult language, and everybody is to be, I think, congratulated for the efforts. It is even harder to publish in technical English, scientific English. I think there are 2 things that are worth talking about in that sense, and one is most journal editors really do want to publish good science, and if the article is good science and the English sort of gets in the way, most journals will take the time to spend a little more time with that article. Now, sometimes it doesn't always work, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but I think non-native English speakers should get help from a native English speaker if they can. If not, a good example would be the abstract, which usually has a word limit. And I would encourage non-native English-speaking authors to write an abstract that has all the information in it. Don't stick with the word limit. If the journal wants it, they'll shorten it. But to make sure that the information is there. Now, one of the things that's happened in the last 10 years is that the number of articles received by scientific journals has increased incredibly. And most journals are not big journals. You know, JAMA, for example, has 4 senior editors. It has a large production facility that has full-time staff. And that's the exception. Most journals, the editor is a part-time editor, probably is still seeing patients on the side. Sometimes is emeritus, so he's half retired and so forth. And they may have a full-time secretary or a half-time secretary. And the point is that when the number of articles submitted to a journal increases, it very quickly brings the system down, because the journals simply do not have enough time to give every article that they receive a good review. So they began to do a language review. You would get a manuscript in the mail, and the secretary or somebody would open it up, and if the English was too difficult to understand, it would be returned to the author immediately. This is unfortunate, and everybody knows about it, but it simply was not practical for the journal to spend a lot of time with each of these articles to determine which ones they would accept and which ones were not. This created a market for what are called language polishing companies. Now, a language polishing company is basically an editorial service, but it tends to be focused on the presentation of the science rather than the science itself. And they will say, if you send us your article, we will guarantee that if your article is rejected, it will not be rejected because of the language. Many people think that that means that the article will be accepted, and it's not. And even though many of these companies, I think, are legitimate, I think they work hard to provide a good service to authors, many do not. And many will charge quite a bit of money to provide editing in this language polishing service, and the results are not particularly beneficial. I encourage authors to use the premium service if there is one, because it is important for an editor to edit deeply, we would say. For example, I can go through an article and I can edit it once. I can start at the title, and I can see that the title is awkward, and so I might change the title, and then I would edit the paper. That might be all the language polishing company would do, is that one edit to the manuscript. But when I would go back through the paper a second or a third time, that title is likely to change because I learn more about the article. I'm able to put the pieces together a little differently, which means that the article may be edited by a language polishing company, and it gets by the initial English screen, and then it's rejected 10 minutes later when the journal editor begins to read the introduction, and the introduction doesn't make sense scientifically. And so I think there's a real problem with that approach. I think that science needs to be done well, that the manuscript needs to be well written and well edited so that it communicates well. And I'm not sure that many of the language polishing companies do that, and I'm not sure they're able to do it given the cost that it takes to edit an article. The appendix, and I know you just finished translating the book, the appendix is already out of date. Much has happened since the original article that I wrote that is reprinted there. I mentioned that many authors have to publish something, and so they study something that can be studied rather than something that needs to be studied. With a systematic review, any author, even early in his or her career, can ask an important question and answer it well and have a good chance of getting published in a high-ranking journal. because a systematic review is not clinical research. It is secondary research, but you don't need a research hospital, you don't need IRB approval, you don't need a long follow-up period. I mean, all of the usual things that make clinical research so difficult. What you need is a library or access to the literature, and if you are a careful researcher and you take the time to learn something about systematic reviews and meta-analyses, with very little money and a lot of work and some training, anybody can in fact publish articles that mean something. And that's why I included that as an appendix, because to me it does several things. First of all, it allows physicians and researchers early in their career to make a good contribution right away. They can get published in the best journals if they do it right. The second reason is it doesn't cost a lot of money for them to do that. They don't have to have a lot of infrastructure, so forth. The third is that most physicians are not going to be researchers. They're going to be doctors. And research is so difficult to do that it makes no sense to teach someone to do research if they're not going to be researchers. On the other hand, if you're going to practice medicine, a systematic review of a topic in your area will make you a better clinician, whether or not you begin to do research or not. If you do want to go into research, you've done your systematic review, now you know who is publishing in the field, you know what the common endpoints are, what the common problems with the research are. You are much better able to plan original research because you have done the systematic review of research in that same area. So to me, it's a solution to a lot of problems, and I think that many medical schools are missing the opportunity to teach their students how to do systematic reviews and how to do them well. In a sense, my art is judo, and we define jiu-jitsu as giving way without giving up or giving in. And when you negotiate with an author about the manuscript, you don't want to say, this is the way it will be. You negotiate, and you give way without giving in or giving up. You still end up with a good publication, but you do that not by forcing it, but by accommodating the needs of the author. So that's one way to do it. The other way is, of course, if you don't do it my way, I'll break your arm, which is... Well, I think the next research project that I will do, and I don't know that this is something you will ever have to translate, fortunately. I have collected medical writing books for several years. I have about 100. There are probably many more than that out there, especially in the last couple of years, but they get expensive, and that's too difficult to collect them all. The earliest is 1900, and as time goes on, more and more books, of course, have been published. And my current interest is to do a content analysis of each of those books. The idea being that if someone picks up a book on medical writing, what will they think the profession is from the basis of these books? And my hypothesis is that most of those books are at a very low level of sophistication. Most will deal with grammar and syntax and vocabulary, but in a medical example, for instance. There may be some work on how to do a table, how to prepare a photograph, and those sorts of things. But as we move into the 21st century, one would hope that more topics would be introduced and more relevant topics. For example, statistical reporting. For example, not only how do you edit a figure in a table, but how do you arrive at the form of that figure in the table sooner than you used to? And this, what I want to do is to see if the profession is advancing, and I want to know where it came from, and I want to know what needs to be done. And I think that this systematic review, if you will, of medical writing books may in fact help understand that history and that development. In fact, if you look at these books, they typically fall into three classes. Most are written by physicians who had a long career of publishing, and almost always these are men. They published a lot in their field, obviously. So if they were orthopedic surgeons, they would publish in orthopedic journals, really would never have occasion to look at a hematological journal or an obstetrics journal and so forth. Well, they then assume that everything that they did in their career, in their publishing career, was what everybody else should do. And so they write these books, and it's very clear that they never looked at any journals outside their field. They have a very limited view of what medical writing is. The second group of books, a much smaller group, are typically written by authors from the humanities, generally English majors, who for one reason or another begin to work with scientists and physicians to help them publish. And finally they said, well, we'll put down what I learned and we'll put it in this book. But their training is not medical writing, and their training is usually in literature. They are good with the language, but their mindset is that of the humanities, not that of the sciences. And so these books also have some substantial problems. And the last group is maybe only half a dozen books that are written by people who know what medical writing is. They've done it for a lot of years. They have a perspective that is broader than a single physician, that is broader than a humanities person. And these are the books that really have the core of the profession in it. And I say there's not very many of those out there. But I think that the systematic review will reveal the differences between those three groups. I wrote this book for you and for all authors who need to get published worldwide. You could buy lots of books, but I'm not going to make much money off of it. So I didn't do this for the money. I did it because I want science to be better. It is true that publication is the final stage of research. If you put a lot of time and effort into doing research, you should also put a lot of time and effort into publishing that research. And this book, I hope, will help you how to do that.